Welcome to the beginning of this series where I'll introduce you to Godot while we make an FPS shooter game. So, just a quick overview of what's going to happen during this series and a few disclaimers. So, let's just start off with the disclaimers because I think this is a pretty important one. If you wanted to implement multiplayer features in your game, that is not happening in the series. Partially because that is way too advanced for our scope, or my scope, I guess. And in this guide or series, I'm hoping, and as long as you will pay attention to at least some of the videos, maybe, I guarantee you'll know all the basics, all the fundamentals of Godot, and you'll be like 100% ready to implement your own features, create your own projects, create your own games, almost anything. And my goal, or my goal is to teach kind of the mentality to create games and to code, which it might be a little hard to do, but that's my complete goal for this entire series. Alright, so let's just get started so we don't waste too much time. So if you notice at the top rightish, there's a new project button, and that's obviously what we're going to create. So you can click that and name the project whatever you like. So I'm going to call this FPS Game, and then game guide. And now we need a project path. So this is where everything is going to be stored in your game. And you're going to click browse and find a place you'd like to store it. So for me, I have a folder called Godot, and in the folder I have individual folders for all my projects. That way they're stored neatly, and I'm going to do the same for this one. So if you're going to replicate what I'm doing, just create a folder called Godot and then double click into that folder and then press select current folder, and you'll get like a little warning. Just where you typed in the project name, click create folder. And I know that I'm probably going to edit a blurry kind of filter onto this because there's personal information in my file system. So if you have like any trouble of exactly what I'm describing, then just ask me down in the comments and I'll answer them as fast as possible. Alright, so click create and edit next. And just, it'll take a bit to load in for the first time. And now we're inside the editor. So I know there's probably a lot of things popping at you at once. We're just going to take this one step at a time. So let's go over the file system first, because I think that will be quite important. Alright, so the file system is at the bottom left, as you can see, and this will be basically the same as if you're using a file explorer. Like, you can't see it, but like a normal Windows files or whatever Mac uses, probably decently the same. And our project is going to need that. So if you right click on this folder, the res:// folder, you can click this option, or you can hover over it and click folder to create a new folder. So your PC or laptop has multiple folders, right? You don't have everything in just one folder. And that's what we're going to do for our project too. We're going to create multiple folders so we're organized and everything is neat. So let's do that. So we're gonna create our first folder, sorry, and we're gonna name that to assets. And then we're gonna create another folder and make sure you're still like highlighting the res folder. And we're gonna call this one main. And then we'll click on another folder and call it player. Throughout the course of this series, we'll obviously add more folders, but for now, these should get us started. And I'll go over what exactly is going to go inside these folders. So the assets folder is going to be where all your textures, your models, all those things are going to be placed inside the assets folder. However, they're not going to be all bunched up in there. They're going to be placed in within their own specified folders, which we'll create when we actually create the assets. And then we have the main folder, which is where our maps are going to be placed. Our maps mainly. And then we have our player folder, which is, as you can tell, where our player is going to be placed. So what can we even place in these folders? This is a good time to go over nodes and scenes. If you already know what these are, you're free to skip ahead, but if you don't, nodes are basically the building blocks of Godot, and they're going to be the building blocks of your game. And you can see that we're prompted with a root node, and all a root node is basically the parent of all other nodes in our scene. And I'll explain what a scene is shortly. So for this video, we're going to be mainly focused on the map, and that's why we're going to click on the 3D scene root node. And just to remind you, there's an option to click other node, and you can see all the nodes within Godot. And each node has its own kind of features and cool things it can do. So you can imagine the camera 3D node will give us the ability to use a camera. There's also like 3 distinct kind of main classes of nodes. So there's a node 2D, node 3D, and a control. I'd like to think the controls are almost always used as GUI or UI. Node 3Ds are going to have nodes that are in the 3D space, and 2D is just going to be the same but for 2D. So there's not going to really be any times, I believe, in this series where we have to use a node 2D, because we're going to be creating a 3D game. And that's why we're just going to click on the 3D root node. Alright, so what we just created is a new scene, and our scenes are basically made up of nodes. They can also be, I guess, visualized as walls, and it'll make sense once I start explaining myself. So you can imagine bricks as nodes and our game as a house. Now we know houses need walls, so that's why I said scenes are the walls, and the walls are made of bricks, which are nodes. So hopefully that kind of pieces everything together, and this is another way to keep your project organized, and you'll see later on in the series how useful creating separate scenes are, but they make your workflow like 10 times more efficient So if you're thinking of not using scenes, change your mind now. Alright, so the first thing we're going to do is make a basic map. So we created a root node, and you can see at the top that this scene is unsaved. So to fix that, we're going to press Ctrl S, which is the keystroke to save in Godot, and we're prompted with our file system. So we need a place to store this scene, which is what we discussed earlier, which is going to be in the main folder. Except we're going to rename this scene as map 1 in case we want multiple maps in the future. Hint, just letting you know. And then, yeah, that's all we're going to do. We're just going to click save. And if you look in your file explorer or file system at the bottom left again, you can see our scene is now in it. And if we exit this scene and we want to go back to our map scene, we could just go throughout the file system and double click on the map scene, and this will pop up. Another way of finding a scene in your or anything in your file system is by using the filter bar or search bar. So I can type map 1 and the map will appear. So that's useful. And we're just going to rename this node, which you can do by double clicking. And you can highlight. I'm pretty sure you can just single click too. Yeah. And then rename that to map 1. Alright. So we have our root node, but this doesn't look much like a map, does it? So to fix that, we're going to use a different type of node. So we're going to add a new node. The plus button at the kind of top left, and then we're going to search for a mesh instance. Alright, so another cool feature in Godot is the inbuilt documentation. So there's no need to open the Godot documentation online. It's all inbuilt into the editor. So what I mean by this is, if you notice the right side, there's a little button that says doc, and we can click on that. And this will give us a description of what the mesh instance is. So you can see a node that instances meshes into a scenario. And for this case, it'll be our scene. And you can think of this as if you were importing a model into your game. This lets us visualize the model, which is, preferred if you want a good game. Alright, so obviously you can't see anything yet, and that's because we haven't changed any properties. So properties are on the right hand side. They should be under inspector. And there's quite a bit of properties. Some of these might look confusing, and some of them actually are. So we're not going to go over every single property because that would take a long time. Instead, we're going to go straight to adding a mesh, and the mesh will let us visualize stuff. So if we click on this empty box, we can set the property to one of these options, and we want to build a map. So we don't want a cylinder, and we don't want a sphere or a capsule. We want a plane mesh, and a plane mesh is basically a flat surface that doesn't have anything in the y direction. And I think it's a good idea to just quickly go over the 3D space. So you have 3 axes, right? You have the X one, the X axis is the red one, the Z axis is the blue one, and the Y one is the green one. And if you take a look in our properties and under transform, you'll notice a position. So if you look closely at the Y value, when I erase this, the Y value goes up, away from 0. And if I move it down below this origin point, then I got negative numbers, right? And I'm going to click this undo button or reset button, which will reset everything to the default value. And also, we're going to click over here, we're going to click on mesh, and you'll notice new properties have been added. So we have size, and this is too small for an entire FPS game to go upon, I guess. So we're going to increase this to 100 on the X and 100 on the Y. So you can notice that this only has 2 axes for size, and in 2D there's no Z axis, so that's why it says Y instead of what would be Z on the 3D axis or on the 3D view. And we have a pretty bland, I don't know, floor. And in the next video we'll go over collisions and the rest of the player. So we just went over quickly how to add a mesh, but now we're gonna kind of set up a player. So in the next video we'll go over collisions and kind of scripting the player. In that way we can get everything done in a short kind of time frame. So we're going to create a new scene because we don't want our player to be under the map scene. We want it to be created in its own scene so that if we have multiple maps, we can kind of easily add the player to each map. And again, this scene stuff, this node stuff, it will all make sense as we go along. Alright, so we're going to create a new scene, which is this plus button at the top, and it says a tooltip comes up and it says add a new scene, and that's what we want. Except we do not want a node 3D. We do not want any of these options. So we're going to click other node, and we're going to search up character body. And let's press create. And let's press Ctrl S to save, except we don't want to save it in the main folder. So we're going to click this up arrow, and then we're going to double click on the player folder, rename this scene to player, and click save. Alright, so a warning pops up within the editor. It says this node has no shape, so it can't collide or interact with other objects. For the purpose of this video, I'm almost certain this warning won't be solved, but in the next video it'll be all sorted out. So ignoring that, we're going to create a mesh for the player. Obviously, when we play the game, we want to see a visual representation of the player. So let's do that. I'm going to type in mesh instance. And also, a quick keystroke you should build a habit of using is pressing Ctrl A and Control A opens the node or create a new node kind of panel or window, and that's pretty useful. Saves you a second, I guess. And now if you remember how we made our floor for the map, we're going to do the same for the mesh for the player. And we're going to click on a capsule mesh instead of a plane mesh. In a capsule mesh, the reason why we chose it will be explained further in the next video, or it will make more sense in the next video, but basically it just helps. It's just smoother with the kind of collisions, and obviously we don't want a flat mesh for our player, so like our options are either like a box mesh, cylinder mesh, or sphere mesh, I guess. Or there's actually quite a bit, but we're just going to use a capsule mesh for this point in time. And I forgot to mention earlier, if you notice that I have 4.0.3, that doesn't matter as long as you're above 4.0. This series should work perfectly for you. There should be nothing different, but if there is, and you do figure out a way to solve these problems, I'd greatly appreciate if you could put it down in the comments exactly what you did. Anyways, so we have a mesh, but if we actually run the game, we're not going to see anything, that's because we didn't add the camera node. So we're going to press Control A on our root node, and let's type in camera. Okay. So we have our camera in camera node, and you notice there's completely different properties except the node 3D properties. So all nodes with under the node 3D will have the node 3D properties, and that's kind of actually I'll save that for a later video because that might be too confusing. My bad. Anyways, we're gonna actually add another node, and it's just gonna be a plain node 3D. And what we're gonna do is we're gonna drag this camera 3D. So click and hold, and drag your mouse over node 3D and release. So you notice there's like a little indent kind of between the nodes, and all that does is it makes the camera 3D a child of this node 3D. And this basically, our scene builds up a scene tree. A scene tree is basically, you can imagine like an actual tree. It has different branches sprouting out from it, which you'll understand exactly what I'm talking about later on. But yeah, so this camera is a child of this node 3D, which also means this node 3D is a parent of the camera 3D. So what the use of having a child node is, when you do add a script onto a node, you can reference its properties easily without having to get a reference to the node from a scene tree. And again, I know I keep on saying this, but it'll make sense in the previous videos or in the future videos. Okay, so we're gonna press Control S, and we're gonna rename this to neck. So hopefully that gives you an understanding where this node should go. Obviously we don't want our neck to be halfway up our body, so let's move it slightly up, and you can notice that the camera moves with it. That's because all child nodes will inherit their parents' position in the 3D space. And it's the same as if you rotate it. So you can see I'm rotating the neck, but it's also rotating the camera. And yeah, so these little kind of circles, that's how you rotate things on a certain axis. Obviously you can still edit them within the properties. And the scale, you can scale with these, or translate, sorry, with these little squares. And you can scale nodes by using the property over here. But there's also more distinct separate tools for these. So there's a scale mode, there's a rotate mode, and a move mode. If you ever want those, you could use that. Alright, so I think this is a good stopping point for this first video. And the main focus of this video was just to introduce you to some key concepts of Godot. And I hope you guys enjoyed this video. And if you guys have any questions of anything covered within this video, then please let me know down in the comments. And I'll post the source code either in the comments or description. So that way, if you are ever confused about the code or you did something wrong and you don't know where, you can check it. And that will be a useful tool later on as things get more complex. Anyways, thanks for watching.